The release of Genshin Impact was a coalescence of the perfect circumstances a video game developer could ask for. With a captive audience and an appealing premise accompanied by no shortage of aggressive marketing, MiHoYo, later turned Hoyoverse, was able to enter the public consciousness in a bold and lasting way, fundamentally changing the landscape of not just the once niche gacha gaming industry, but even placing a mark on the greater video game world itself, becoming as close to a household name as a gacha could get. The roaring success of Genshin Impact spawned a desire by Hoyo to produce more titles, as gaming companies are apt to do, and just over 3 years later, Honkai Star Rail was brought into the game. Indirectly based off the narrative continuity of Honkai Impact 3rd, Honkai Star Rail built upon the foundation of Genshin, sharing much of the same mechanics, gameplay flow, and even UI design choices that its predecessor had. Instead, however, choosing to take a more traditional turn-based combat approach. Riding out the coattails of Genshin's success, HSR also became a top-ranking title in the gacha space, having very comparable impact on the market if sales and topic relevance are accurate metrics to go by. The game at one point may have even been considered the more popular of the two games during its heyday, especially at a time when mainstream excitement towards Genshin began to wane. However, just as quickly as players were excited about Hoyo's second title, did their excitement burn out. Having made a video on Genshin Impact losing popularity earlier this year, I feel like it's also time to have a discussion on why Honkai Star Rail is losing popularity, especially in light of what's been going on throughout version 3, not just in the scope of gameplay, but design choices and overall player sentiment. To better understand the rapid decline of public interest in Star Rail, a good place to start would be to detail how it even became successful in the first place, wherein one could potentially have been made aware of this being a likely outcome even as early as the very beginning of its release. Taking inspiration from just about every possible facet of Genshin Impact, even down to the way it looks to character stats, menu arrangement, and whatnot, despite being a turn-based game diametrically opposed to real-time action combat in every which way one can think of, an overwhelming majority of HSR's player base comprised players belonging to either or both of Hoyo's preceding titles. From my experience, I haven't met a single player who joined HSR that didn't also play Honkai 3rd and/or Genshin. Predictably, a central, albeit controversial topic of discourse in the first couple months of its debut was the incessant comparison between Genshin and HSR, typically with the intent to disparage the former by pointing fingers at the growing lack of care and maintenance Hoyo was giving to Genshin at the time. Though they were made by the same parent company, players immediately took notice of the slightly better quality of life features, one of which being the availability of resources. To this day, it can be quite annoying for character materials to be unavailable to grind for based on what day of the week it is in Genshin. You might call it a trivial inconvenience to gripe about, but it's especially relevant in this situation because again, combat experience aside, HSR was incredibly similar to Genshin from a detailed point of view. So naturally, players will focus on the things that weren't the same between games, and superficially, Star Rail appeared to have implemented solutions and fixes to a number of minor yet recurring issues in Genshin. All that is to say, Honkai Star Rail's reputation was primarily and holistically established on a comparative basis. In simple terms, rather than being its own standalone title just made by the same company, a huge proportion of players evaluated HSR based on its apparent superiority to Genshin experientially speaking, and while it did lend itself to drawing more players to HSR, it also would be one of a couple reasons that eventually led to a rapid decline in player interest. I don't exactly blame the game for turning out this way. Ostensibly, HSR did do a lot of things better than Genshin. Better quality of life, better first impressions, more viable starting units, a more extensive endgame, and just more things to do after you hit that content wall. Presumably, they were the more generous of the two as well, especially when they gave away a free Dr. Ratio to every player, who at the time was one of the stronger DPS units in the game. Meanwhile, Genshin players got Aloy. The running narrative throughout 2023 was how it felt like Hoyo was giving more attention to Star Rail at the expense of neglecting Genshin. The second half of Genshin's version 3 only exacerbated that, with multiple filler patches that didn't particularly draw much attention to the game. In a way, just as Genshin had the perfect set of circumstances to be successful, so too did Star Rail. Instead of reinventing the wheel though, they modified the wheel by adding some fancy bells and whistles to it. All the while, the original wheel began to rot. Things really came to a head in 2024 when praise for HSR and criticism towards Genshin were at a fever pitch. The monumental success of Penacony further contrasted from the many PR mistakes Genshin made during that time, chief among them being the frankly disrespectful 3 polls to celebrate 3 years of Chinese New Year. At this point in time, Star Rail was adding even more engaging storylines, characters, game modes, and so on that it actually became in vogue to make fun of how every single good thing Star Rail did was something Genshin could never do. Hence the meme, Genshin could never. Silly as it may have been, this constant comparison was partly responsible for Genshin's decline, as I covered in that video. Not just in Star Rail, but even third-party competitors like Wuthering Waves were learning from the mistakes and complacency of Genshin by doing everything that Genshin didn't do. Star Rail was the one leading the charge, resulting in early version 2 being the golden age of the game. I would go so far as to say from around 2.0 to 2.4, Honkai Star Rail may have been the more popular game of the two between itself and Genshin Impact. It was doing everything right, building on what it established before, and not only fleshing out the meta, but adding several highly influential and charming characters like Robin, Akron, Aventurine, Firefly and such, adding more endgame content to give us something to work towards, continuing with their quality of life improvements, and so much more. While Genshin was suffering from a lack of evolution, Honkai Star Rail was evolving quickly. Some might say too quickly. Just as a game should be wary about remaining stagnant for too long, they should also take heed to not accelerate too quickly, especially in a game built upon microtransactions, a trait that defines the gacha industry for better or worse. Genshin's lightning in a bottle success was so profound that I believed it didn't have to do anything and it would keep that level of success in perpetuity. Star Rail, on the other hand, believed it could do anything and keep that level of success as well. Anything as long as it was bigger, better, or faster was always a good thing in their eyes, because for an entire year and change, the community was praising how fast Honkai Star Rail was moving and bashing Genshin for moving so slow, or not at all. Ironically, this would end up becoming one of the biggest reasons behind their eventual decline. For all the hype and excitement players throughout the game with the release of many version 2 units, it was pretty hard to overlook the sheer jumps in power between characters. A small degree of power creep was to be expected, but the kind of power creep that players were accustomed to was like Jingliu vs Sila or Huohuo vs Locha. The gap in strength between Akron and the reigning DPS units at the time though was on the level of trying to compare Mavuika with Hu Tao. Mind you, this wasn't even a full year into Star Rail's timeline. The gap between version 2 and version 1 units was noticeably wide, which when accounting for the time span, that definitely raises concern over the sustainability of such a pace. It would be understandable if, say, all version 4 or 5 units are convincingly beating out version 1, but for most if not all version 2 units to be entire leagues ahead of version 1, players are growing fearful of whether or not the same would happen in version 3 and onwards. Coinciding around that time was a constant release schedule of 5-star characters. While Hoyo has been including a number of serviceable 4-stars like Marchaith and Gallagher, with the sole exception of 2.6, every single version since the day they came out has had 2 5-star characters, placing enormous strain on the budgets of free-to-play, occasional spenders who buy just like daily jades and battle pass, and even some dolphin players. Alongside characters, light cones are also beginning to get stronger and stronger too. On top of offering stronger bonuses, some light cones afforded their wielders entirely new properties that could enhance their performance beyond simply just stats, like additional characters in and of themselves. All the while, endgame content began increasing in difficulty at a commensurate rate to account for the growing capabilities of new units. HP inflation was a heavily prominent topic of debate during the second half of version 2, as players began to take note of how much tankier everything was getting. Eventually, it got to a point where if you couldn't actively pull for at least 1 or 2 characters per version, you were at risk of falling behind in the endgame. Power creep often gets thrown around carelessly in video games, but Honkai Star Rail was justifiably power creeping by most people's definitions. That would only be further proven by most of version 3's units, who presently dominate the apex tiers of the game. In addition, they bring with them mechanics and conditions that require many other modern characters. Remembrance characters are especially guilty of this. In Hoyo's defense, they have been giving us a couple free units that are quite powerful, such as RMC, Archer, and a free copy of Terra Dan Hung. But given the circumstances, they weren't generous additions to the game, more like a lifeline for players to be able to keep up with the rapid acceleration of endgame. There are recounts on thousands if not tens of thousands of players that usually go along the lines of the game simply moving at a pace no one except whales can keep up with. It has gotten so bad that Hoyo had to issue direct buffs to several version 1 characters. No small adjustments either, they were basically doubled in power, and even then Silverwolf, Jingliu, and Blade are still high tiers at best. Such action like this is an explicit acknowledgement of HSR's power creep. They wouldn't have done it otherwise. Characters that just a few months ago were insta-clearing MOC, Pure Fiction, or APOC effortlessly are now having trouble meeting the point threshold. Imagine being a player who joined the game because you really like a certain unit like say Aventurine or Firefly. For them to no longer be able to clear the endgame comfortably in less than a year, it can lead to disappointment and frustration. As you know, frustration results in a loss of agency, and loss of agency is the single greatest determining factor influencing a player's decision to quit playing the game when they lose control of their ability to complete it. I used to wail on this game myself, and even I found myself losing interest in spending on the game because I knew in just a few months that character would likely get power crept anyway, so then what was the point? Gameplay wasn't the only side of things where Star Rail was becoming too ambitious. Penaconian was a huge upgrade in storytelling and world-building exposition compared to either Eurilo 6 or the Shenzhou. However, an early complaint some people had was how excessively hyper-verbal the story became. So much dialogue and so many characters with so many different build-ups made it difficult for players who weren't keeping up to date with the story to, well, keep up with the story. Early parts of Euphorius were notably marked with poor presentation and needlessly verbose exposition, causing players to feel overwhelmed by the sheer amount of things they had to keep track of. If you thought Penacony had a lot of moving parts, Euphorius was even bigger. When a story becomes too grand, it begins to grow exhausting to have to keep up with everything, since neglecting even a single part will cause you to miss critical information. Kind of the same thing the Marvel Cinematic Universe did after Avengers Endgame. You're practically obligated to watch every single movie and show given how connected everything is now. As exciting as it may have been to see the Honkai 3rd XPs, especially fan favorites like Cyrene, I couldn't help but feel like the Chrysalis heirs were marketed to just be shiny new toys to spend money on with how commodified characters have become gameplay-wise. I particularly wasn't a fan of the global passive thing they added to casters. It presents a slippery slope that would pressure players even more to pull for certain units, not because they were charming or memorable, but because of the fear of getting gimped without their custom mechanics. After a while, the novelty of Starl began to burn out for many people. The game was moving too fast, the story was becoming too big, and Starl was becoming too unsustainable. At a certain point, it felt like less of a game and more like a job. You don't get to do these things, you have to do these things. Otherwise, you'll fall further and further behind. This do-no-wrong mentality Honkai Star Rail inherited from Genshin gave rise to the same eventual enshittification practices. Eidolons and signature icons went from an optional thing to make a good character better into potential obligations on account of how impactful they were. Power creep in and of itself is a form of enshittification. Because HSR is a gacha game, they intentionally don't give you a sufficient amount of free jades in order to coerce you to spend money to pull for characters, and with how frequently the game pumps out new 5-stars, it only puts further pressure on you. Adding the new Remembrance Path may have started out as an interesting expansion, but now we're beginning to see it's a cleverly disguised way of forcing you to buy every Remembrance unit signature Lycone, since they can't use other Lycones from different paths despite technically being the same role as those paths. Global passes like Casters, which granted hasn't been replicated since then, but the genie's out of the bottle. It can and will happen again later. At the same time, I can't remember the last event that was actually memorable. I know people sort of feel the same way with Genshin's events too, but considering Hoyo's decision to make the Euphoria story go the entire length of version 3, they kind of went all in on that and paid very little attention to other aspects of the game. In other words, if you're not much of a story person, there's nothing else to do in the game. Star Rail has no overworld exploration or even a Serenity pod to keep you busy. It's all story and combat content, so once you finish up the current endgame cycle and catch up on the story, there's straight up nothing to do except wait for the next story. There were also just a few other blatant acts of enshittification Hoyo put into the game throughout version 3. During the second anniversary, I was mildly annoyed at the constant barrage of microtransactions they were throwing at us, and I'm sure a lot of you felt the same way. Every time I logged on, I felt like I was being assaulted by packages or things to spend money on, like I stepped into Raid Shadow Legends. It just really deflated the game's experience during that time. Anniversaries are meant to be opportunities to show a company's generosity and gratitude for the community's support towards the game. Instead, it felt like they were just trying to milk us for more money. Actually, recently, the whole farce of the Cyrene weapon skin costing 20,000 stellar jades really left a sour taste in my mouth. Having to spend the equivalent of a 5-star character, or even 2, just to get a weapon skin, not even a weapon, in a single-player game meaning you can't show off the skin is the most out-of-touch thing I've seen in my entire life. I was staunchly against when League of Legends came out with the exalted $500 skin line. Seeing this was a repeat of that exact same situation, only it might have been even worse than this game since you can't even flex it to other players. You're playing a single-player game. A single-player game that, by the way, people make cosmetic mods for free. Enshittification often happens when a game begins to lose players. They feel compelled to pull the same numbers as they used to, but with a smaller customer base. That's why you see Hoyo aggressively pushing out more microtransactions like the exorbitant weapon skin, because the player base is actively going down in size. Lastly, I believe it comes down to the fact that the gameplay loop in HSR might be even more repetitive than Genshin's. One of the main criticisms I had towards the combat was how painfully bare bones it felt. You have only 3 actions to press at any given time compared to other turn-based RPGs that give you a wide assortment of different options to choose from. With only 3 buttons per character and no ability to use items or anything of the sort, the gameplay experience doesn't really have much depth. It's just redundant or monotonous action over and over again, likely the reason why power creep is taking over so fast. The only way to make a unit stand out from another is by making them stronger, due to the absence of any other way to differentiate them. Couple that with the lack of anything to really do on a day-to-day basis after you finish a story and run through the current endgame cycle, and it makes for an ultimately bland experience, an experience that demands you to wail on the game to continue experiencing it. Star Rail tried so hard to be better than Genshin, to try to one-up Genshin and try to surpass Genshin, that ironically it ended up becoming Genshin and falling into the same traps and downfalls that affected Genshin. The game is to cater towards all audiences, casual or hardcore, spending or free-to-play, but in just 2 years it became one that you basically had to play full-time to keep up with everything, or grind like it's the only gacha you play despite most players having 3 or more to go through on a daily basis. This game punishes you for even taking so much as a month or 2 off, since in that short span of time you could find yourself permanently behind both the story and the endgame, the only 2 parts of the game that receive any attention. With no events, no exploration, or really any other side thing you could do, and the game growing increasingly more expensive and cash grabby, eventually you'll find players burning out, getting bored, or simply losing interest. The best way I can describe HSR is that it found something it was really good at, and then kept trying to push the limits of what it was good at until eventually it priced itself out in the market. I don't know why, but Hoyo games have a knack for starting off really strong and then driving their players away by either being lazy and doing nothing of import, or going too fast that players just can't keep up. Although then again, the same can be said for most other gacha games. Anyways, let me know your thoughts on this in the comments down below. Do you think Star Rail has gone past the point of no return, or can it revitalize interest back into the game? That'll be all for today though, so if you enjoyed the video, I would appreciate it if you'd like to like and subscribe. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter @FarSam, join my Discord server, and check out my other Honkai style discussion videos if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.